making changes, progress and politics. Evolution is change, nothing more or less. Carl Zimmer. It is a trite observation that time and tide wait for no one. Canute learned this much to his chagrin, and every other would-be commander or commentator is well advised to remember this mundane wisdom. Indeed, change is one of the few indisputable facts of life. In truly paradoxical fashion, it can safely be reported that change is a constant feature of the world. Whether considered locally or over vast eons of time, change is what makes the world what it is. The central challenge, therefore, for anyone who wishes to understand or affect the world is to come to terms with change and incorporate its dynamics into any account of how the world or its constituent parts work. Consequently, any account of legal and biological life that does offer an important role for the fact and effects of change will soon itself become a victim of historical change. Nevertheless, human attitudes to change are no less complex or perplexing than the phenomenon of change itself. Being part of the changing world, human views on the hows and whys of change are themselves constantly changing. At the heart of this intellectual challenge is the persistent effort to fathom the relation, if any, between change and progress. While there is a wide, if often begrudging, acceptance that change is inevitable and inexorable, there is also considerable disagreement over not only the pace and dynamics of such movement but also its direction and putative destination. This debate and controversy is as heated in law as it is in any other field of study. In a world in which law has a relatively privileged place in addressing and channeling political power, the issue of whether the common law is merely changing or making progress is of considerable moment. As, I would hope, is obvious by now, my own take on what counts as progress is that it is itself as much a matter of change as anything else. As a work in progress, progress itself is a question of changing sensibilities. The basic thrust of the jurisprudential as well as the biological challenge is to explain the tension between stability and change. Whereas even the most reactionary theorist admits to some need for change, the most radical critic concedes that a degree of stability is desirable. However, despite the often robust disputes over the appropriate balance of these forces, there seems to be a shared commitment to the underlying idea that there is some elusive but enduring method or measure by which to locate a workable proportion between stability and change or between tradition and transformation. Moreover, this algorithm must not only achieve such an equilibrium but also ensure that any changes or transformations are always in the direction of normative improvement. In short, jurists and judges must be assured that, in spite of the occasional setback or wrong turning, things are getting better and better by dint of the common law's own social discipline and historical development. This is a ludicrously tall order. The search for fixed foundations or constant equations to guarantee the common law's progress is as mistaken as it is unrealizable. The best that can be hoped for is that, like nature itself, the common law remains supple, experimental, and pragmatic. While judges and jurists must forego the quest for a formal method to direct and sanction universal change, they must not abandon the pursuit of substantive solutions that might contribute to local justice. Indeed, in finding ways to improve the quality of the common law, critics and commentators might do well to heed Darwin's apparent conclusion about nature at large that it is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Nevertheless, in being alive to the possibilities of change, it is important for lawyers to resist the temptation to essentialize or deify change. There is no lasting or greater normative appeal to perpetual change as opposed to perennial stasis. The balance between the two will be local, variable, and tentative. As the history of the common law amply demonstrates, it is often possible for there to be change without improvement, but it is rarely possible for there to be improvement without change. Change might be constant, but progress is contingent. In this chapter, therefore, I explore the political terrain on which the different accounts about when, what, and how some changes might be counted as being more progressive than others take place. Indeed, the very notion of progress is as problematic as it is central to the biological and jurisprudential community. In the first section, I canvass the debate in biology and law over how change might be interpreted as being progressive and suggest the difficulties with such a debate. In the second section I continue this inquiry by focusing on the methodological disputes in science over whether ideas of progress can be attributed to claims about knowledge. Drawing on these epistemological encounters, in the third section I demonstrate how a particular Darwinesque explanation of evolution jibes well with the common law's historical development. In the fourth section, I explore the implications of genetic engineering and biotechnology generally for the validity and worth of efforts to understand evolution in biology and law through the kind of Darwinian lens that I have proposed. In the fifth section I look at the common law's potential for effecting good and bad changes as a measure of its moral and political valence. Throughout the chapter, My overall ambition is to problematize the whole notion of progress and demonstrate that what passes as progressive is as local and historical as any other idea. As Robbie Burns put it, look abroad through nature's range. Nature's mighty law is change. Like life and law, progress itself turns out to be a work in progress, a better fit. One of the central issues that has dogged both scientific and jurisprudential debate has been the perennially controversial question of progress. It behooves any scientist or jurist who is serious about his or her discipline to take some stand on the freighted relation between the notions of change and progress. To frame this debate in terms most appropriate to the project of this book, the enduring line of division is fairly predictable. Is change in nature or law simply a shift from one state of affairs to another over time? This is what I call the chronological thesis. Or does that shift occur in the direction of a better from a worse state of affairs? This is what I call the normative thesis. There is obviously an intimate connection between this controversy and the question of whether nature or law is unfolding in line with some design or is moving closer to a more perfect approximation of its essential self. The capacious shadow of a creationist approach falls over most of the entanglements in both scientific and jurisprudential study. Notwithstanding this, many scientists and even more common lawyers subscribe to an evolutionary account that eschews a creationist commitment but still insists that there is a positive and progressive movement to nature or law's development. However, it ought to come as no surprise to learn that I do not subscribe to such a position. I maintain that nature and law are simply moving on largely in response to the demands and opportunities of their changing environmental situation. Neither always getting better, or worse, nor advancing in any particular direction. They are simply changing. While no one should be taken only at their word, I tend to agree with Darwin's own assessment that, after long reflection, I cannot avoid the conviction that no innate tendency to progressive evolution exists. The debate in biology over whether nature progresses is persistent. Since before Darwin's time and now after, scientists have locked horns over whether there is any normative direction to nature's chronological development. Is there advancement or only alteration? Is there an evolutionary scale or order that measures the relative pace and development of particular organisms? Is the bear higher on the evolutionary scale than the beetle or birch? And has the bear progressed in evolutionary terms more than the beetle or birch? Despite the few explicit attempts to argue that there is evolutionary progress and the many implicit acceptances of such evolutionary progress, there are almost no cogent accounts of what the concept of evolutionary progress might mean and what valid inferences might be drawn from such a concept. Moreover, I would argue that there can be no explanation of evolutionary progress that does not smuggle specific prescriptive preferences into universal descriptive terms. The distinction between facts and values and between objective and subjective is by no means as clear as many scientists and lawyers would argue or assume. The line is deceptively blurred and itself shifting between a. accounts of progress in terms of the phenomena to be described or evaluated and b. accounts of progress in terms of the methods or explanations that are used to describe or evaluate those phenomena. On the account of Darwinian evolution that I have elaborated and defended so far in this book, there is no reason to assume that evolution would move in a straight line at all. Indeed, there are many reasons to suggest that evolution would not move in a straight line. Even if it did move in a straight line, there is no reason to assume that it is constantly moving from good to better. The traditional normative approach generally assumes that there is some upward movement to evolution. See Figure 1. Whether evolution is thought of in gradualist terms, that is, through a relatively stable and incremental flow over time, or in punctuational terms, that is, by large saltations sandwiched between periods of stasis, it is claimed that there is, over the long haul, a sure and steady progress. However, the key challenge for proponents of this approach is to identify and define the elusive quality that evolution is supposedly embodying more and more over time. Although it was not always the case, there are few scientists who would insist that there was an overt ethical cast to this quality. The belief that evolution possesses an ethical quality is confined to the hardline creationists. The two main candidates for the task of fleshing out the quality are complexity and fitness, yet their similar and related claims do not hold up to critical scrutiny. For instance, the connection between greater complexity and progress is far from clear. First of all, complexity is not an all-or-nothing quality. It can be a balance between more and less complex. The relative complexity of an organism is usually accountable more by reference to its rate of evolution than any definite assessment of its overall structure. While some organisms change more quickly than others, this is hardly tantamount to their being more advanced or better. Moreover, it is unclear whether this measure of complexity is to apply to nature at large or to particular organisms. While the overall system might be becoming more complex, This not at all the same as claiming that all organisms are becoming more complex or that an increase in complexity is the same as progress in the sense of getting better. Furthermore, there is little necessary correlation between becoming more complex and becoming more fit. The relatively less complex earthworm is no less fit than the relatively more complex emu in the sense of its environmental or reproductive success. In general, there are three general adaptive levels of organisms: the well-adapted, the ill-adapted, and the adaptively neutral. While their particular balance will likely shift and change, it is likely that they will all be present at any time. However, the adaptiveness of any organism is not absolute and intrinsic to the organism. It will itself vary relative to its local environmental context. To take any other position is to essentialize adaptiveness, which is a long way from the evolutionary ideas of Darwin. The tendency to local, that is, in specific historical and environmental circumstances, adaptation in individual organisms cannot be equated with any systemic tendency to universal progress. The animal that changes from being darker-furred to fairer-furred in response to changing environmental conditions is not by virtue of that fact becoming more fit in any universal sense. Indeed, the creature might well be relatively less adapted than its earlier darker-furred ancestor. Today's well-adapted organism can become tomorrow's ill-adapted organism if there is a significant enough change in environmental conditions. Consequently, while complexity might increase at certain times and in certain ways, it is neither an inevitable nor inexorable phenomenon. Progress is not about greater complexity. It is only about organisms changing in ways that are a better adaptive fit to the present circumstances of their lives. Of course, this can occur by an organism becoming more simple than complex. The average survivor is better adapted than the average non-survivor. However, this only applies if the environment remains relatively stable. If there is a significant change, then previously well-adapted organisms will become less adapted or even maladapted. Against the so-called normative accounts of natural selection, therefore, one can argue that evolution does not progress or result in perfect or optimal results. It is an entirely context-specific and relative process that picks the best of what may be a bad lot. Indeed, mindful that about 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct, one can state with confidence that the failure to adapt is more the rule than the exception. Fitness is not equivalent to better, but simply a shorthand conclusion for the fact that an organism or one of its evolved features works well in the sense of being adaptively successful in particular circumstances. Indeed, it is highly unlikely that a process such as natural selection, when properly understood, would move in a straight line, whether morally enhancing or not. By and large, evolution will be asymmetrical in that organisms adapt to the environment, not vice versa. See Figure 2. Moreover, while some organisms will have an impact on their local and immediate environment, which in turn will affect the evolution of the fittest organisms, there is no evidence to suggest or suppose that the environment itself changes in accordance with any set plan or predictable logic. By assuming that adaptation has some Whiggish tendency, Darwin's central ideas are ignored or shamelessly bastardized. In this regard, Bulldog Huxley and his pack are much closer to Soapy Sam's flock than either would care to contemplate. In light of these particular cautions about talk of evolutionary progress in the natural world, it is possible to offer some general observations about progress in the common law's development. The conclusions are far from encouraging to those committed to any kind of ordered or progressive movement. The chronological thesis seems to have a considerable edge over the normative thesis. There is little basis for jurists' tendency to maintain that evolution is weeding out the ethically bad from the ethically good. It is, of course, entirely sensible to talk about law in terms of its substance and merit. This is the standard fare of much jurisprudential work. However, if it is difficult to give a fixed and objective meaning to the quality, in biological study, it is doubly so in the world of law. If it is intended to signify some moral standard, the debate over the criteria for substantive or ethical worth is as contested as any debate could be. Even if one could agree on such criteria, it is hard to imagine that the common law's development would be moving in one advancing direction, whether by smooth gradations or by jerky steps, as suggested by Figure 1. Even the most traditional scholar is prepared to concede that there are spurts and stalls in the law's development. Moreover, it is also unlikely that the movement of the common law would be historically flatlined, as the gradualist approach urges in Figure 2. No traditional jurists would seriously advance the claim that the law is always in exactly the same state of moral worth, whether it be high, low, or middling. It is much more likely that, insofar as law could be measured by reference to one particular set of moral lights, it would rise and fall in its success, as recommended by punctuated equilibrium approach in Figure 2. Accordingly, if we are looking to locate some regimen or rule to describe and forecast the future development of either the common law or its social environment, then we can do no better than subscribe to the law of higgledy-piggledy. As tantalizing as it is, both the common law and the social environment only offer up the secrets of their development after the event. Jurisprudential wisdom, like most varieties, is always better in hindsight. In both law and nature, ideas of progress quickly become confused with directionality. It is difficult to posit progress in any moral sense without posting a destination toward which such change is getting closer and closer. However, such a possibility remains attractive to the common lawyer as it holds out the promise of both predictability, that is, knowing where we have been and where we are headed will tell us what comes next, as well as an authority, that is, the basis for prediction is scientific as much as speculative, to the common law's historical development. However, if there is no progress and there is no historical directionality, the acceptance of historical accident and contingency will perhaps persuade people to abandon claims to authority and predictability. Furthermore, people might also come clean on their own normative preferences and recognize that law does not give meaning to life, but that life gives meaning to law. In short, accepting that life is as much accidental as planned, one might grasp that the ambition of total command is illusory. While it is true that law might evolve in the direction of greater fit with its environment, there will always be a productive tension between the law's notion of fit and the changing social, political, and cultural makeup of that environment. Like nature, the common law is a pragmatic and piecemeal response to changing social conditions over time. It is a historical and, therefore, political endeavor in which anything might go. That anything rarely does go is an indicator not of certain natural qualities to law but of persistently constructed constraints that require examination for relevance and validity. Again, it is the common law's tendency to stability rather than transformation that baffles. The fact that law changes is a given. The fact that it does so selectively and slowly is what should engage jurists' attention and analysis. Making progress. As the debate over whether there is progress in nature discloses, the possibility of offering a factual and value-free account of biological development is itself a matter of considerable controversy. The most recent and most important contretemps over the matter of scientific progress involved the titanic clash between Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. Although they each stake out apparently incompatible positions, there is much that is shared in their epistemological conclusions. This exaggerated sense of opposition is as true for them as it is for Wilberforce and Huxley and, also, Dworkin and Posner. Both Kuhn and Popper recognized the necessary prerequisites of commensurability and testability. More importantly, in contrasting the prevailing views of these scientific philosophers, they both agreed on the essentially cumulative nature of science in that it was the facts that a theory revealed rather than the theories themselves that were accumulated. However, they disagreed over the role of values in scientific methodology and the measure of scientific progress. In a striking parallel with similar jurisprudential exchanges, while they share an acceptance that history must be given a more prominent and inclusive role to play in the tradition of scientific explanation, they are at odds over the nature of that role. Although Popper is clear that the history of science is, by and large, a history of progress, he casts history as a rather clean and tidy process. It is a source of order rather than disruption. In contrast, Kuhn recognizes the unsettling quality of history and adopts a more warts-and-all approach. While both Popper and Kuhn rely on a Darwinian model, they profoundly disagree over the force and consequences of such an alignment. In short, like their jurisprudential counterparts, they part company over which idea of progress is implicated in an evolutionary approach. Is it possible to historicize without also politicizing? Is political development about improvement or simply change? Popper explicitly contends that change in science can be modeled on that of Darwinian evolutionary biology. As with birches and bears, he claims that there are continuing cycles of variation, selection, and transmission in the realm of knowledge and ideas. He suggests that there is an analog between genetic mutation and the proliferation of new ideas and theories. In the same way that nature selects among the proliferation of mutations, so the scientific community tests and chooses between the competing theories on the basis of scientific falsifiability. For Popper, the empirical method does not test for the truth of theories but seeks to corroborate them through failed efforts to prove them false. The ambition is not to save the lives of untenable systems, but, on the contrary, to select the one which is by comparison the fittest, by exposing them all to the fiercest struggle for survival. Accordingly, in the world of science as in the realm of nature, while truth is more protein than transcendental and knowledge is more contingent than constant, there is nonetheless a direction to knowledge that is progressive and orderly. There is a move forward in knowledge in both quantitative and qualitative terms. Importantly, however, Popper does acknowledge that, while a theory, or, at least, the set of facts that it adduces, becomes more corroborated and reliable, it will never become complete and true in any eternal sense. Moreover, not content to make such assertions in the world of scientific research, Popper makes the trademark bulldog move and draws political conclusions from his epistemological claims. He maintains that the best institutional structure and political arrangements to establish and ensure such evolutionary progress through a conflict of ideas is to be found in the liberal tradition of democratic governance. Such an open society is recommended not only as an ideological preference but as a scientific necessity. From what has already been argued in this book, it ought to be clear that Popper's conception of Darwinian evolution is extremely controversial and frankly unpersuasive. Rather than resolve the debate over whether progress occurs in a Darwinian account, Popper simply argues by assertion and assumption. The role of history and environmental conditions is reduced to a neutral and contained backdrop to the dynamic and almost exclusively internal operations of the scientific community. Indeed, there are so many problems with Popper's claimed Darwinian approach: the static relation between process and environment, the vague mechanism of variation, the mysterious criteria of selection, and unexplained method of transmission, that is difficult to take it seriously as anything more than an unwarranted and unwise attempt at homological comparison. It is more the Darwinian imprimatur that is sought than any imitation of its theoretical integrity. Nevertheless, that having been said, it is not surprising that there is much tacit sympathy for such a Popperian perspective in jurisprudential circles. When applied to law, such a gradual and inevitable process holds much appeal as it showcases the virtues of ordered development, substantive betterment, and principled continuity. Like birches and bears, the law is considered to move forward by adapting its past to present conditions and by ensuring that this adaptation carries forward the past into the future. The common law advances by evolution, not revolution. Moreover, it is not only a naturalized process but also a sanitized one in which the true and good will always triumph over the false and bad. Serving the political ends of many liberal jurists, it validates the claim that law is not politics by insisting that adjudication is somehow a neutral and insulated process, uncorrupted by the ideological forces of power and self-interest. Standing in almost direct contrast to Darwin's proposal in the biological world, where organisms' historical development is largely a series of localized responses to changing environmental conditions, this Popperian account has legal and scientific ideas advancing almost solely by dint of their own essential rational logic and their own internal epistemological force. In the same way that this view has not gone unchallenged in the jurisprudential world, Popper's account of scientific inquiry has not persuaded all scientific commentators. The most decisive and debilitating response to Popper has come from Thomas Kuhn. Whereas Popper maintained that scientific knowledge accumulates through a so-called falsification process akin to natural selection, Kuhn expanded on this by showing how science was an inescapably social undertaking and that it was, therefore, difficult to see scientific development as a process of accretion. Science occurs and was made possible by the existence of disciplinary matrices or paradigms, which are situated within history's political currents, not apart from them. According to Kuhn, paradigms are essential to scientific inquiry because no natural history can be interpreted in the absence of at least some implicit body of intertwined theoretical and methodological belief that permits selection, evaluation, and criticism. The typical developmental pattern of mature science is not through a steady and cumulative acquisition of knowledge, but through the successive transition from one paradigm to another through a revolutionary phase. Moreover, in that paradigm shift, there is a degree of so-called incommensurability between past and present. Within an established paradigm, progress is obvious and largely uncontested in that a set of shared problems are answered in a mutually agreed fashion so that there is an increase in articulation and specialization. Scientists work only for an audience of colleagues that shares values, beliefs, and standards that can be taken for granted. However, this ought not to be treated as comparable with an inexorable closing in on some ultimate truths. More solutions to more problems might be achieved, but this is not the same as an ever closer approximation to a final and complete account of nature. Because there is a movement away from something does not mean that science is making an irresistible advance toward some fixed, objective, and supreme destination. Not surprisingly, Kuhn too likened his approach to that of Darwin. He concluded that the analogy between the evolution of organisms and the evolution of scientific ideas is nearly perfect. Like Darwin non-biological evolution, Kuhn did the same for the evolution of scientific knowledge in that he refused to accept the existence of any teleological or goal-directed account of evolution. At best, what occurs is that successive stages in that developmental process are marked by an increase in articulation and specialization. Eschewing any internal or directional logic to evolution, Kuhn insisted that, in the same way that the interaction between organisms and changing environmental conditions determines the course of natural evolution, the resolution of scientific crises is affected by the conflict within the scientific community over the fittest way to practice future science. In short, for Kuhn, Scientific progress is as much about professional values and institutional commitments as it is about neutral methodologies and objective knowledge. There has been a process of evolution from primitive beginnings, a process whose successive stages are characterized by an increasingly detailed and refined understanding of nature. But nothing has been nor will be said that makes it a process of evolution toward anything. If we can learn to substitute evolution from what we do know for evolution toward what we wish to know, a number of vexing problems may vanish in the process. As a result, for Kuhn, scientific inquiry follows a messy and meandering path rather than develops in an orderly and linear progress. It is only the list of explicable phenomena that grows. There is no similar cumulative process for the explanations themselves. These theoretical paradigms stand or fall not only on strictly scientific criteria of verification and predictability, but also on the sociological basis of their ability to provide emotional satisfaction and thus to inspire commitment in specific social, political, and historical conditions. Indeed, the reception of Darwin's evolutionary theories are a good example of Kuhn's idea of scientific revolution. There is a continuing and repetitive history of resistance, controversy, change, and acceptance that rolls on over time. The shift between biological paradigms is about persuasion as well as proof and about how to look at facts as much as the facts themselves. While Kuhn's conclusions are not equivalent to stating that in the sciences might make right, they oblige an acknowledgement that the line between science and politics is as murky and shifting as any other historically situated demarcation. Whereas Popper insisted on the political necessity and logical possibility of a clear boundary between the ideological and scientific approaches to reality, Kuhn contended that all that existed or could exist was an observable cultural and sociological distinction. In this way, Kuhn saw scientific knowledge as neither relative nor absolute, but rather as the efficacious product of an irreversible and non-directional historical process. Whereas Popper saw a smooth and progressive curve to that history, Kuhn recognized that history was much more jagged and less serene, with science moving not only in fits and starts, but also in many directions at once. For Kuhn, what turns out to be the fittest way to practice science is a historical function of the prevailing consensus within the scientific establishment, not simply the result of a chronological progression in line with a logical criterion of validity. Science is distinctly of the messy world that it seeks to explain and understand, even if it too often pretends that it is not. Shift happens. The historical record suggests that Kuhn's ideas and interpretation of Darwinian evolution have a definite salience for explaining the common law's development. In the same way that there is progress in normal science, that is, within an accepted and established paradigm in which there are a wide series of group commitments, in that puzzles are solved and facts accumulated, there will also be progress in law. Rules will be refined and principles will be honed. This can be illustrated by numerous common law or constitutional doctrines in which the court makes a breakthrough decision and then sculpts out the more detailed contours of the new rule over an extended period. For instance, having established the general concept of privacy in Griswold, the courts have worked to interpret and carve out the precise contours and limits that substantive due process possesses in particular circumstances. Again, having abandoned the separate but equal interpretation of the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection in Brown, the courts have busied themselves with identifying the shape and substance of a more encompassing mode of constitutional equality. In both situations, however, it should be clear that, while the development of such doctrinal details may appear to be technical and uncontroversial, their elaboration is as political as the initial decision that made the original breakthrough, albeit often it is of a more modest and focused nature. Moreover, in the same way that the breakthrough decision often occurred as a relatively revolutionary decision, so there will arise a subsequent doctrinal crisis, as in Roe and Lawrence, in which what was once thought settled no longer meets contemporary demands or expectations. It is not so much that the developed doctrine will have run into internal difficulties in the sense of being found to possess latent illogicality or incoherence, although it well might. Rather, the doctrine will be seen to have outlived its substantive usefulness and the courts will be tempted to discard it for a more immediately well-adapted set of rules and principles. It is as much that it has lost its political salience from an external perspective as it is that it has been found professionally wanting from an internal standpoint. In short, law and its particular doctrines are seen to be thoroughly political in their eyes, elaboration, and demise. Legal tradition demands political transformation. However, while it is reasonable to talk about progress within a particular doctrine, it seems wrong-headed to talk about overall progress in constitutional law or the common law generally in the sense that a particular doctrine reaches a level of sophistication, complexity, or fitness that makes it somehow perfect or even simply better for all time. Like the biological organism, the common law is only as good or bad as its informing environmental context. No legal rule is intrinsically good or bad in some global, eternal, and abstract sense. The lessons of 9/11 confirm that what is and what is not settled or desirable law is always open to revision and alteration. Lawyers too often mistakenly label the highly adapted doctrine as a universal legal good that can be relied on in all circumstances, in all places, and at all times. However, the history of the common law suggests that all such judgments about doctrinal merit must be contingent and conditional, as the furry animal cannot be said to have the perfectly colored coat outside of a particular environmental milieu, that is, brown for temperate conditions and white for polar conditions, so a legal rule or principle cannot be said to be legally ideal outside of its environmental setting. Moreover, because there is a movement away from some particular legal doctrine toward a different one, it does not mean that the common law is becoming more pure or more close to its immanent supreme form. Any particular doctrine must be assessed in local as opposed to universal terms. The fact that the doctrine of substantive due process was once thought to be inapplicable to the privacy claims of gays and lesbians, or that it is later thought to be applicable, is evidence of prevailing views of political substance, not enduring attributes of legal form. As one commentator has astutely observed, the common law can only be understood if it is seen for what it is. It is not a romantic ideal or a divine gift or the acme of judicial genius or even the legal aspect, naturally superior, of the most politically wise and refined race, but an interesting human construct. The creature of times and places, of economic forces and class interests, of battles for power between political factions and trials of wits between lawyers of great skill and inventiveness. Whatever else it is, the common law is a work in progress that is always on the move and that is moved along by historical, social, political, and moral forces, themselves beyond any simple or fixed elucidation. The history of the common law is as much one of discontinuity and contingency as anything else. Lawyers struggle to deal with the socio-political forces that impinge on their lives and to which they contribute to their activities. Progress is an entirely practical and temporal matter, as opposed to some abstruse and metaphysical measure. It is simply about solving problems by closing the gap between present aspirations and existing actuality so that the world can become a locally better place. Not only will those problems change over time, but those aspirations will also change. Indeed, there is no epistemology that operates as something above rhetoric, and there is no metaphysics that is something above rhetoric. Like debates about substance, there is nothing beyond persuasion among real people in real situations. The demand for integrity or consistency falls down because, at a suitable level of analysis, sometimes high and sometimes low, most things can be made to look more or less coherent. Indeed, despite its hubristic arguments and ambitions, modern jurisprudence manages to confirm the modest Kuhnian-style claim that the practices of law and philosophy, like science, are no more, and no less, than a human pursuit, situated, fragmentary, and flawed. Like all histories, the development of the common law is best understood as a way of coping that is more or less successful in direct proportion to its capacity to achieve substantive justice in the contextual circumstances. Judges who make so-called bad decisions do so largely because of their substantive political leanings, not because of the weak or incorrect judicial method that they deploy. The decisions in Roe or Lawrence are not right or wrong because of the formal merit of their judicial techniques, but because of the lasting appeal of their substantive politics. Settled or fixed principles are simply those that have acquired and still manage to retain sufficient support in the political scheme of things. Basic principles do not so much obviate the need for politics as provide a marker for them. Contrary to what mainstream jurists believe, formal methods cannot save the law and judges from themselves. Judgment is a substantive instinct that can never be applied in any easy, sweeping, or uncontroversial way. For example, in a recent historical foray into the common law, D.J. Ibbetson provides an informative and detailed tour of the law of obligations history. It is a fascinating and traditional trip. It is almost entirely descriptive and accepts most things at face value. There is no real effort to capture the dynamics of the common law or its socio-historical setting. It is a formalistic and internalist account of law. Instead, Ibbetson relies on an implicit and immanent logic in the common law that seems to thread together the eclectic efforts of multitudinous judges across vast time and varied contexts. There is a strong Popperian flavor to this process. For Ibbetson, the common law proceeds by way of an internal, mysterious, and fixed logic that balances the pull of tradition and the push of transformation. In an admittedly untidy and apparently chaotic process, the common law manages to twist and turn itself through tried and tested maneuvers, that is, inventive gap filing, extensive exceptionalism, subtle distinction drawing, etc., to meet fresh demands as it remains true to its controlling and enduring ideas. The price of flexibility is the cost of complexity. Informed by such an account, Ibbetson argues that there is a structural continuity that runs through the law of obligations from the 12th century to the 21st. After a sweeping series of extravagant claims, he concludes that the virtues of ordered development, substantive betterment, and principled continuity are present. Whatever changes have occurred on the surface of the law, and whatever accretions have been incorporated into its fabric, at a deep level the structure of the common law has remained remarkably slow-moving. Like an ancient building in continual use for centuries but readapted to satisfy the needs of each generation, the medieval ground plan of the common law of obligations remains visible through all the reordering of its internal features and change of use of its component rooms. There is so much that is wrong with Ibbetson's analogy. It suggests that change has been reluctant, that there is a steady decline in the common law, that the common law is a relatively inorganic process, that the sources of change are mysterious, and that there is a structural continuity that transcends or underpins any changes effected by time. Most importantly, this architectural analogy entirely elides the fact that the development of the common law is not simply a neutral alteration by the ravages of time. Insofar as there is any continuity over time, it is the combined work of particular actors and social forces. Historical patterns and doctrinal trends are little more than medium-term effects of local efforts at the best thing to do. What counts as the best thing to do will change as the political circumstances and social contexts shift. As Kuhn asserts, part of the answer to the problem of progress lies simply in the eye of the beholder. I take this to mean that perspective is important and that what counts as progress will not be a given fact but a matter of commitment to particular paradigms, because there is no theory-independent way to reconstruct phrases like really there. Of course, there can be a workable level of prediction at a very local level and in specific contexts, but the larger and more general questions will never be resolvable in any final or persuasive manner. The sheer complexity and richness of contingent social life ensure that confidence or certainty in fixed solutions will remain elusive. This is no bad thing. As Popper ironically noted, there can be no explanation which is not in need of a further explanation. If this is relevant to scientific inquiries, it is doubly pertinent to studies of law and society. There simply is no fact of the matter when it comes to understanding the historical development of the common law in particular societies. Another way of expressing this idea that is more salient to this book is that law and legal theory are never an answer that can speak for themselves. It all depends on the political context, which, of course, always speaks out of both sides of its mouth and in a garbled accent. Kuhn identifies the existence of such a state of affairs in science. Even if he does not chart them in any sustained or detailed fashion, he showed how science was much like any other discipline in that it required sources of cognitive authority and intellectual control in order to protect the communal culture from rebels and renegades. These sources might include pedagogical techniques of professionalization and knowledge management, hermeneutical devices for delineating the range of accepted meanings, and institutionalized procedures for legitimating transformative initiatives. If such conditions are in play in science, they are doubly evident in law. There is no need to go as far as Kennedy's claims that law school is an education site for the reproduction of hierarchy in order to demonstrate that initiation into the common law tradition is as much about acquiring certain habits of mind and internalizing certain values as it is about learning vast bodies of legal rules and honing various research strategies. The law school experience and early years in legal practice combine to offer the common lawyer not simply the facts of law but a particular way of looking at those facts. Indeed, it is the considered view of many jurists, both of a soapy Sam and bulldog strain, that law school can only do its job satisfactorily if it supplies prospective lawyers with a so-called suitable, that is, one that reflects the particular advocate's professional and political commitments, orientation about law's role in society. As with science, what turns out to be the fittest way to practice law is a historical function of the prevailing political consensus within the legal establishment. It is not simply the accumulated outcome of an objective and logical process. Law is most distinctly of the messy, contested, and value-saturated world that it seeks to understand and regulate, even if it too often pretends that it is not. The only injunction that the common law seems to offer to its judicial and juristic operatives is go slowly. The claim is made that the common law is not only a formal process of argumentative growth, but that it is also a substantive framework that places real constraints on the content and direction of common law development. However, the history of the common law recommends, contrary to what Ibbetson and his jurisprudential clan propose, that anything might go provided that one can persuade others that such a doctrinal change is substantively desirable. Of course, if it is possible to persuade an already institutionally predisposed audience of lawyers that such a change is more a continuation of a doctrinal tradition than a radical break with it, then so much the better. However, As the incidence and importance of great cases illustrates, even a doctrinal and abrupt revolution will be accepted and the go slowly injunction ignored, if the proposed change is sufficiently palatable to the substantive political appetites of the legal and, on occasion, public establishment. As Figure 3 shows, the legitimacy of the common law is more dependent on the rate and style of doctrinal development than its substantive content and direction. Legal feathers are much more ruffled by sudden switches in direction than slow accretions over time. The snail is the chosen biological symbol of the common law, not the hare. Nevertheless, such a traditional go-slowly account of the common law, even when its injunctions are actually being heeded, has nothing to say about what is the best thing to do, where to go slowly, or whether there are any substantive limits on change. It is all about the pace, not the direction, of movement. Again, the common law is a work in progress whose progress is not channeled by law's own logic, structure, or extant values. On the contrary, the common law simply works itself in line with mediated pressures of its informing social, historical, and political situation. Like so much else, to repeat Kuhn's view of scientific work, part of the answer to the problem of progress lies simply in the eye of the beholder. In a post-Kuhnian world, it has been said that to experience discomfort at the discovery of the uncertainties inherent in science is a mark of nostalgia for a secure and simple world that will never return. I might add, that this is a secure and simple world that never existed in the first place. It only appeared to be secure because admission to the scientific ranks was usually granted to the elite few, and it only appeared to be simple because there was a reasonably wide consensus on the values to be promoted. A similar situation holds in law, where nostalgic sentiments for a simpler and more stable world are regularly and wistfully expressed. This is a political creed occur if ever there was one. The claim that uncertainty is a modern phenomenon is entirely belied by even the most rudimentary grasp of the common law's past. The Victorian age, as illustrated in Dickens' Bleak House, is hardly the fabled stuff of clarity and simplicity. The yearning for certainty is a thinly veiled plea for more homogeneity and uniformity in the legal profession. The trend toward a more diverse demographic in terms of gender, race, class, and sexuality is to be halted, or at least to be limited to altered appearances than changed values. Even more so than science, law is a site where the facts are intimately connected to the approved way of looking at them. What counts as a valid contract is hardly conceivable outside a particular legal ideology. However, rather than view recent changes in personnel and values as harmful and discomforting, common lawyers would do better to recognize that such developments are not at all inimical to the proper understanding of the common law as a work in progress. If the common law is a professional and political tradition, it is one of change and transformation. Shift happens. This ought to be a cause for reassurance, not regret. Off Lamarck. While there are a number of similarities between movement and development in law and in biology, the operation of the common law has been different in that law is not as ultimately restricted in the short term as natural organisms or patterns of behavior. In biology, what presently exists limits the extent of the changes that can be made over the immediately ensuing generations. The structure of existing organisms precludes certain changes and mutations. After all, bugs cannot become bears overnight, even if they might do so given enough time and with the appropriate range of environmental prods. The evolutionary trip from the primal soup to Homo bouillabaisse is a very long one of over 4 billion years. In law, the transformative possibilities are more immediate, the trip is much shorter. Although the precedential traditions of law might well act as a kind of institutional check on doctrinal metamorphosis, its structural constraints are not as embedded and unavoidable as those necessitated by the mechanisms of Darwinian descent by modification in the natural world. Nevertheless, in the world of common law adjudication, it is quite possible for such dramatic transmogrifications to occur. Common lawyers can create and select any solution they wish. Indeed, not only are there ample real-world examples of such revolutionary interventions, but these so-called great cases are often celebrated as defining moments in the life and process of the common law. The point about the common law is not that everything is always in the melting pot, but that you never quite know what will go in next. Consequently, as history reveals, the rate and control of change in the biological and legal worlds was very different. However, whatever has been the case is now no longer as obvious or as uncontested. The relatively recent advent of biotechnology, especially genetic engineering, has put a change to all that. Change might be as immediate and as controlled in biology as it has been in law. Genetic engineering is not a new phenomenon. The ability to manipulate or modify organisms through controlled breeding and experimental mattings has existed for centuries. What is new is the sophisticated advance of genetic engineering. Only a couple of decades ago, the innovative frontier was located around efforts to perfect artificial selection and reproductive intervention through a variety of biomedical techniques. For example, in vitro fertilization. This is now relatively old hat in that all the present commotion is about biochemical efforts to manipulate directly the genes themselves through recombinant DNA technology, for example, cloning. Scientists have developed the capacity not only to create new species, but also to interfere deliberately in the cellular constitution of existing organisms so that specific changes will persist as a particular cell multiplies. While there are many limits to the application of these techniques, it is likely that these will become fewer as scientific research continues. Logic, physics, imagination, and moral sensibilities will become the only restraints. Moreover, once it is appreciated that these techniques can not only be used to breed desirable traits in plants and livestock but also be utilized in re-engineering human chromosomes, the broader implications, that is, political, social, moral, etc., become readily apparent. In this way, genetic engineering, as well as other biotechnological innovations, for example, cognitive neuroscience and neuropharmacology, holds out immense promise as well as enormous peril for its future development and use. Human control over life's processes. There now exists the opportunity and responsibility to tamper with the very fundamental terms of existence. It is a challenge of Promethean proportions because now a species is not merely a hardbound volume of the library of nature, but it is also a loose-leaf book, whose individual pages, the genes, might be available for selective transfer and modification. For all the improvements in medical treatment and agricultural production, there are likely to be dubious possibilities for human well-being from genetic engineering as well as unintended and malign consequences. The Specter of Eugenics, a term originally coined by Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, for the study of human biological improvement, hovers over biotechnology. There are as many Jeremias on the biotechnology scene as there are Pollyannas. Genetically transformed is not exactly a universally favored moniker, whether applied to pomegranates or people. While we seem to have cracked the code of life, it does not follow that we know what it means or what should be done with it. Like all other languages, the genetic code will not speak for itself. Indeed, the biotechnology revolution not only changes what we can do but threatens who we think we are. It challenges our moral and ontological sense of ourselves as much as our medical and social appreciation of ourselves. However, there is no reason to assume that this colossal power will be exercised for the human good or that there will be developed concurrently a better critical faculty for discerning what that human good is. Ironically, it was Bulldog Huxley's grandson, Julian, who foretold some of the philosophical implications of the trend toward greater control over the future development of life. He said that humans are no longer satisfied to understand the creative mysteries of life because they are fated to become the creators of those mysterious lives. As such, people become not merely the products of the evolutionary process but also the business managers for the cosmic process of evolution. It is an exciting as well as frightening prospect. In an important sense, the biotechnology revolution has introduced a Lamarckian-like dimension to evolutionary biology. It will be remembered that Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, 1744–1829, laid the foundations for much of modern evolutionary biology. He convincingly explained the contested move across time from simple molecules to complex organisms. However, he made the unfortunate blunder of claiming that such development was brought about through the heritable effects of learned habit modifying the various parts to fit and adapt to changing environmental conditions. This notion of evolution through the inheritance of acquired characteristics is in direct contrast to Darwinian's thesis of modification by descent. If one keeps in mind the fact that Lamarck was working even further before the discovery of Mendelian genetics than Darwin, then his failure to understand the principles of mutation and transmission is hardly surprising. Nevertheless, not only has the Lamarckian implication that there is only an indirect effect of changed environmental conditions as the organism experiences new needs and adopts new habits been decisively rejected, but the related claim that variation and evolution was, therefore, more directed than random has also been abandoned. The presumed connection between growth and inheritance is no longer a part of accepted wisdom in that genetic research has demonstrated that inheritable DNA is not affected by the growth of the parental organism. Instead, it is now accepted that mutations occur independently of and are transmitted without recourse to the development process. While Darwin had conceded that habit, after sifting and repetition, might become instinctual over time and be duly inherited, he did not accept that such adaptations occurred through a conscious act of will by the organism. Consequently, while organisms have an inherent capacity to vary, a Darwinian account of evolution stands against the Lamarckian idea that there is an innate tendency to progressive perfection because such a concession would import an unsustainable teleological element into biology. By suggesting that the biotechnology revolution has introduced a Lamarckian-like dimension to evolutionary biology, I do not mean that Darwinian ideas must be reconsidered or that Lamarckian insights are valid again. On the contrary, I simply mean that it is now possible for one species to obtain a degree of willed control over the evolutionary process not only of themselves but the biological world in general. There is now the realistic possibility of the nurture of nature. Consequently, by Lamarckian, I simply make shorthand reference to the idea that some willed intervention in the Darwinian process of evolution is possible. However, I most certainly should not be taken to concede that an organism can will its own physiological and mental transformation such that they can become heritable through genetic transmission or in a gen-like memetic way as some commentators, like Dawkins and Dennett, recommend. In the same way that snakes did not lose their legs through prolonged lack of use and giraffes did not develop long necks by stretching them and passing on the stretched neck trait to their offspring, as Lamarckians suggest, so a brown-furred creature cannot become a white-furred one by only a concerted exercise of its will, no matter how sustained and necessary such a change is to its continued existence. However, what genetic engineering does allow is for such feats to be performed quickly and clinically by the human species. Consequently, while the biotechnology revolution introduces a Lamarckian element to the evolutionary process, it does not replace the Darwinian dynamic. Genetic engineering must act within and in accordance with the accepted Darwinian framework. Humans can transform the snake and the giraffe, but the snake and giraffe still cannot transform themselves. The modern capacity to re-engineer natural development, especially the ability of humans to transform other humans, has important and wide-reaching implications for any effort to understand law in light of evolutionary principles. In particular, the whole notion of design must be revisited in light of the biotechnology revolution. In both science and law, it can be reported that people make plans and act on them. After all, law has always been a rational activity in that people reflect on what is best to do and how that might be achieved. It is not a game of chance or a blatant exercise of arbitrary action. However, even though science has now developed the tools to ensure that biology is not only a random, that is, change is dependent on unplanned and unpredictable genetic mutations, and necessitated, that is, the surviving mutations are those that benefit the organism's adaptive fit, response to environmental situations, it still remains largely beholden to its environmental context. Even after the biotechnology revolution, currently well-adapted organisms, for example, humans, can be devastated by substantial change in environmental conditions, for example, global warming or galactic disturbance. Even on a smaller scale, in both biology and law, individual initiatives are often overwhelmed by a more general unplanned and aggregating dynamic that is response to external conditions. The whole does not discipline the parts in the way that jurists tend to believe. Instead it tends to direct the parts in a way that is externally explicable, even if not internally rational. There is no invisible hand that is working to coordinate the scattered efforts of judicial generations, except perhaps the erstwhile after-the-fact efforts of traditional jurists. Indeed, in contrast to legislation, the common law's traditional appeal is found in its relatively uncoordinated and organic character. Contrary to the soapy sums of the jurisprudential world, the common law's whole is no greater than the sum of the parts, at least not on some consistent or moral basis. Over time, the quality of the common law will occasionally move between being less and more than the sum of its parts, but it will usually be the total of its disparate parts. The common law is chaotic and coherent in relatively equal and contingently shifting measures. Nevertheless, even though in both biology and law, design is a genuine possibility, it does not mean that either scientists or common lawyers are free to do or achieve whatever they wish. Technology has loosened the constraints on design, but it has not done away with them entirely. There are two specific constraints that warrant consideration, the so-called environmental and Frankenstein factors. The first flows from the general fact that any organism's individual development is as heavily influenced by its environmental conditions as it is by its genetic composition. This is particularly the case with human development, which is plastic but not indefinitely so. The connection between genetic engineering and social behavior remains indistinct and tenuous. How a particular individual develops is historically contingent and will itself depend on environmental conditions and adaptation. Even clones will not be exactly alike, as the identical genetic makeup will be differently expressed in varying environmental circumstances. Indeed, the possibility of isolating the molecular pathways between particular genes and particular behavior is remote because of the complex interaction between genes and the environment. The genotype, that is, the DNA, does not exclusively determine the phenotype, that is, the actual organism, because this development is influenced by a host of different and interacting environmental factors and facts. It is a complex meld of nature and nurture in which the genes lay down the ground rules, but in the end our upbringing and experience makes us what we are. Accordingly, while genetic engineering increases the opportunities for human design, It does not dispense entirely with any limits to how biotechnological tools are utilized. Indeed, common lawyers have always known this: the power to reshape the world in line with some desired vision, utopian or dystopian, is still conditional upon environmental factors. The pragmatic bent of the common law has made lawyers and judges understandably skeptical about such grand undertakings. The tentative probe is preferred to the systemic overhaul. This is largely because there is a recognition that whether a particular solution is viable or valuable will depend on the prevailing social and political milieu, which is susceptible to unexpected change. Consequently, while it might be thought that the destiny of life and law is very much what we make it, what we make it will be a combination of what we wish to make it and what we manage to achieve in line with those wishes. What is most important is that the changing environment, political, historical, social, moral, etc., will have an impact on both processes, what we wish to do and what we are able to do. Insofar as many will maintain that what we wish for will be somehow tied to a particular notion of human nature, it must be remembered that there is no nature that somehow stands outside history or its environment that can help us decide what values are and are not worth defending. Human nature is to have no nature or, the same thing, many natures. Humans, including common lawyers, are not free to do whatever they want to do, because what they want to do is affected by the wheres and whens of doing it. Lawyers are as much a product of the social environment as everyone else, albeit with the privilege and position to affect to some extent how that social environment changes. Lawyers are what they are because of the society in which they live and to which they contribute. However, while humans have increased control, they are also not in control. Moreover, it is dangerous and misleading to leave the impression that humanity as a collective is in charge. The fact is that most people are not in control and never will be. Unless there are some massive changes to the extant political systems, it is the fate of many to be the playthings of the few. As recent history painfully reveals, the cloning daydreams of some can so easily become the chimerical nightmares of others. As with scientists deciding what to do about biotechnology, that is, should there be human cloning? Lawyers cannot claim to resolve the future of the common law as though it were a technical matter. They are both matters of philosophy, politics, and even theology. There is a technical component, but it is much more limited and much less contained than lawyers or scientists would have us believe. And even technical matters are much less technical than lawyers or scientists claim. In both science and law, the central issue becomes a political one. Having the power to impact and manipulate the broader physical environment and social landscape, the agenda of study and research must explicitly include questions such as, what do we want to accomplish? And what are we willing to do or give up to achieve that goal? In addressing those questions, be it in law or science, viewpoint will matter. Who are we asking? How do we decide who to ask? What criteria are they to use? How do we decide between equally legitimate but competing visions? No matter how scientists and lawyers seek to finesse these questions, they will underlie all the technical work that they do. Moreover, there are no easy or final answers to be discovered. As both Hadamard and Darwin insist, it will be a matter of historical timing as much as anything else, because we are, at the most profound level, historical creatures whose faculties and fate are beholden to changing historical contexts. There is no method, scientific or hermeneutical, that will rescue humanity from these heavy responsibilities. Effectively, life is a dare whose only resolution is to be found in the injunction to keep on daring. Although this will give cold comfort to most people, the real monster is the idea that, having cloned themselves, humans will believe that what they produce is deserving of admiration for that fact alone. In this sense, it is as much the specter of hubris as that of eugenics that haunts present efforts at transforming the future in both science and law. The second constraint on depicting nature and law as now amenable to direct and designing interventions is the Frankenstein factor. As with any mode of legal revision, genetic engineering will have unintended consequences, and those consequences are, in the longer term, as likely to be bad as good. The ecological interaction between nature and the environment is complex and sensitive. There is no entirely reliable way to predict the future consequences of present changes. Even small quantitative changes can wreak considerable qualitative havoc. The flutter of a butterfly's wing can begin a chain of events that can have massive consequences. This is evident in law. The effects of a decomposing mollusk in a Glaswegian's birthday tipple and of an overflowing Mancunian millpond are still being analyzed and assessed today across the common law globe. Because law is always on the move, fixing one problem will often produce problems elsewhere. For example, extending the circumstances in which tort recovery for pure economic loss is available undermined the limiting effects of contractual privity, and what was once a good or adaptive solution might soon become a bad or maladaptive one. For example, The fixed notion of property developed for a largely land-based economy is unsuited to the requirements of an e-commerce world. Similarly, there are many unanticipated or exaptive features of legal rules that can be put to better use than the purposes for which they were originally contrived. For example, the revival of trespass to chattels to prevent incursions into commercial websites. Again, as a work in progress, the common law is seen to have no inherent essence or tendency to progressive improvement. It is a constantly changing and contingent response to the constantly changing and contingent demands of its environment. By understanding the common law as an organic process as much as a collection of fixed rules, it becomes possible to appreciate that good judging is about local usefulness as much as global coherence. Being a work in progress, the judicial job is never done and must console itself by accepting that this is for the best, not the worst. Moreover, Mary Shelley's cautionary tale of the scientist-made monster who sets off a series of terrible occurrences is worth heeding. Although the chilling force of her original novel has been lost in the slew of derivative schlock horror movies, her message seems to be that it is not so much that people should do nothing for fear of disaster, but that people should be careful that, in doing something, they do not set off a train of events that they will not only regret but be unable to halt. Nevertheless, as a work in progress, the common law dares its judicial participants to run that risk. After all, as both the best of life and law have shown, progress is what people make it. When it comes to the common law, what lawyers make it will be both their responsibility and their legacy. Accordingly, in the last section here, I explore the common law's general potential for effecting both good and bad changes. In the process, I again confirm the force and extent of the critical claim that law is politics, for better and worse. While there is a grain of wisdom to the insight that genes are Darwinian, but civilization is Lamarckian, it is exaggerated and misleading. If it is meant that people adapt to environmental conditions as much by choice as by randomly, or, at least, as instinctive reactions to changing social conditions, it has some salience. To deny such modest claims would be silly. However, if it is meant that genetic makeup or the interaction between genetic material and environmental conditions has no relevance for civilized activities, like law, it is wrong. While people have considerable control over the development of civilization, and, increasingly, the development of nature because biotechnology can achieve what previously took eons of environmental agitation, it is folly to suggest that such control is determinative or self-sustaining. The possibility of social engineering remains as much a conceit as it has ever been. Not only is there no guarantee that the best-laid legal plans of mice and men will not come to naught, but there are no historical grounds for confidence that such interventions will not do more harm than good. As with genetic engineering and legal efforts to regulate it, there is a tendency for lawyers to be asked to shut the institutional barn door after the scientifically modified horse has bolted. The most and the least that can be expected of lawyers and judges is that they do what is best, mindful that this can never be done in anything more than a conditional, contextual, and modest way. Indeed, there is no better example of the common law's concurrent strength and weakness in tackling contemporary moral and political challenges than its halting and tentative efforts to confront the ethical challenges of the biotechnology revolution. Nevertheless, the injunction for lawyers and judges to do what is best will seem at best platitudinous and at worst perilous. It will be protested that they need more specific and substantive advice. For better and worse, none can be offered. The key difficulty is that evolution is largely accepted in the biological sciences as being simply a synonym for change. Unlike in the social sciences generally and in the common law especially, there is no common supposition of improvement or advancement in any universally appealing sense. In short, evolution is an empirical phenomenon of alteration that has no necessary link to normative claims of value. Adaptation to changing conditions is the only standard of success, and this is itself only temporary and local in character. Once conditions change, an adapted feature can become maladapted to its circumstances. Because contingency is the order of the day, it has to be grasped that the quirky as much as the quotidian is the measure of development and change. Yesterday's peculiar is today's prosaic and tomorrow's pass. In a manner of speaking, we are all mutations now. Who we are and what we do are functions of the vibrant dynamic between the constantly active environment and the constantly varying gene pool. In such a world, the common law's fabled injunction of stare decisis et non quieta movia, that is, let the decision stand and do not disturb things that have been settled, seems to be entirely the wrong sentiment or mandate. By relying too heavily on the past to resolve present disputes, common lawyers are likely destined to get the future wrong. It is necessary to cultivate an attitude that holds the push of tradition and the pull of transformation in some sort of balance. However, that balance will not be found in nature because it has no moral quality. Nature is amoral and simply is. Any attribution of moral worth to nature is an entirely human projection. As such, Any questions about the moral status of any particular natural state of affairs can only be asked and answered in moral terms. Furthermore, this stricture applies to the nature of the common law because it has none independent of its particular content and shape at any specific historical moment. Any balance between stability and change or between tradition and transformation will have to be constantly achieved and re-achieved in the maelstrom of history's changes. Accordingly, it is the main force of Darwinian evolutionary theory that biological creatures have no common or essential properties, particularly those that might be grouped together under the rubric of human nature. If they did possess such an ahistorical or non-contingent quality, it would undermine much of evolutionary theory because the microdynamics of natural selection feed on constant change. Variation, whether it is by genetic mutation, sexual couplings, hereditary drift, or the like, is the sine qua non of evolution. Species develop and originate from this fundamental process. Moreover, confronted by changing environmental conditions, these mutating organisms do the best they can to make the best of their situation. Indeed, those organisms that do best are the approximate fitness maximizers. In environmental conditions that can change relatively quickly and often, it is better for one to be jack of all trades because one is better able to adapt to new conditions than if one were master of one trade. In a biological way of speaking, organisms that survive and thrive tend not to put all their varied eggs in the same adaptive basket. As for the common law, it is those doctrines and principles that are best able to adapt to changing social conditions that are more likely to persist and hold their own in the pressure cooker of dispute adjudication. For instance, the fault standard in Anglo-Canadian negligence law has had such a relatively long and successful life because, at least in part, it has been malleable enough to adapt itself to a host of changing demands and expectations. While its political appeal has been crucial, its capacity to adjust its focus, that is, from injurious acts to misleading statements, its reach, that is, from physical damage to economic losses, and its standards, that is, from novices to experts, has enabled it to be vital as well as reliable and to be directive as well as flexible. Of course, this is not to suggest that its adaptability is the perfect or pure manifestation of the common law's enduring essence. It is simply to conclude that, for much of the 20th century, Donegu has been able to remain sufficiently well adapted to the social and economic milieu such that its claims to allegiance are relatively better than its immediate doctrinal competitors. If conditions change or more fit competitors appear, there might well be a change of doctrine. Some have gone so far as to argue that the common law works best when it pays scant attention to changing social circumstances. For instance, Richard Epstein offers a self-consciously static conception of the common law. He contends that the substantive principles of the common law not only can be evaluated as normatively good or bad in themselves without regard to extant social conditions, but also that they should be judged in such an ahistorical way. In no way do social changes require, or permit, parallel changes in the legal order. To put it mildly, this seems a huge overstatement of the common law's operation as an enduring body of transcendent principles. It offers a formalist account that outdoes even the most devoted and fundamentalist of Soapy Sam's disciples. By making an outright rejection of the common law as any kind of work in progress, Epstein seems to elevate the virtue of stability to almost absurd heights and confound the opinions and commitments of almost all judicial artisans of the common law as to what they are and should be doing. Nevertheless, if such a static conception of the common law has any merit, and this is a big if, it is to act as a timely corrective to those who are minded to conclude that the role of the common law is and ought to be exhausted in the effort to simply track and reflect prevailing and changing social circumstances. In other words, in recognizing the common law as a work in progress, it is important to guard against the tendency to convert the need to be adaptive to change into a moral imperative in itself. Apart from the obvious fact that it would be a particularly foolish method by which to attempt a crossing of Hume's chasm, there is little redeeming by way of moral appeal to such an injunction. There is more to life and law than a context-breaking brio in which the ideal lawyer becomes Bruce Springsteen's rebel forever born to run. Such freedom is illusory in that rebellion is not a way of life in itself, but a possible prelude to a different and better life. In social and political terms, there is a difference between the cure and the cured condition. Mindful that change is not always for the better, it will occasionally be the case that doing nothing will be the best way to do what is best. However, it is entirely another thing to suggest that doing nothing will always, or more likely than not, be the best way to do what is best. For instance, after asserting that evolutionary change in the realm of ideas is not necessarily for the better, Judge Easterbrook concluded a judgment by stating that most mutations in biology and law alike are inferior. By any lights, this is a colossal bastardization of Darwinian thought. Mutations are neither good nor bad in themselves. A particular mutation will only be good or bad in relation to its immediate environmental context. In the same way that the utility of a darker or lighter furred mutation will depend on the organism's natural and immediate environment, so the worth of a doctrinal mutation will also depend on the particular social and historical context within which the mutated rule is supposed to operate. For instance, it is mistaken to assume that long periods of evolutionary stasis are reflective of evolutionary excellence. Such stable periods of development usually reflect practical equilibrium rather than theoretical perfection. It simply indicates that organisms have achieved a suitable balance with and within the environment, not that the organism has somehow developed to such an extent that it is the pure realization of its own immanent essence. What exists or what amounts to the so-called natural order has no necessary claim on people's conscience or moral faculty. While it is accurate to state that the smallpox virus was part of the natural order until it was forced into extinction by human intervention, it would be surprising to hear people argue that such a forced extinction was unnatural and, therefore, immoral. Whether it is the smallpox virus or contractual privity, its moral status is an independent assessment rather than related calculation of whether it is part of the natural order. As a work in progress, the merits of the status quo must be defended, not merely assumed. However, in jurisprudence, it is contended that a bias in favor of the status quo is a natural feature of the common law. Judges are required to give added weight to existing precedents and institutional allegiance in their decisions about how to do what is best. In this sense, common lawyers, much like their scientific counterparts, are not divine designers because they rarely give themselves permission to start from scratch. In both nature and even the laboratory, biological evolution has to work from the available genetic material. The same is generally true in the common law. Lawyers and judges do not, or are not supposed to, design doctrinal renovations off the top of their heads. They engage in a mode of bricolage or cobbling together over time of whatever is at hand to make the best contrivance that is possible. In this way, it is about situational optimization, not absolute perfection. Moreover, even if they do wipe the doctrinal slate clean and treat it as if it were legal tabula rasa, which is a task that most courts claim to shun in favor of legislative intervention, it must still be conceded that judges operate within a particular historical context that not only frames the problem to be addressed, provides the fittest way to practice law, and recommends the utility of any proposed solutions, but also helps to shape the values and commitments that they bring to those adjudicative chores. Accordingly, understanding the common law as a work in progress leads to the appreciation that adjudication is a subtle combination of freedom, that is, judges can cobble together the broad range of available doctrinal materials into the artifacts of their choosing, and constraint, that is, judges are historical creatures whose imagination and craft are bounded by their communal affiliations and personal abilities. In this way, anything might go. As their incidence and career suggest, great cases are where a Lamarckian biotechnological dimension and a Darwinian evolutionary dynamic come together. A new doctrinal species can evolve not only by developing existing threads of legal argument, but also by engaging in the judicial equivalent of genetic engineering. John Donne's celebration of change as the nursery of music, joy, life and eternity captures the kind of attitude that common lawyers should take, and the very best among them have, to their judicial duties. Rather than resist or resent change, they should recognize that the main attraction and strength of the common law are its invigorating willingness to keep itself open to change and to adapt as and when the circumstances require. Of course, when it is best to change and in what direction change should occur will be a matter of normative judgment, because law is politics. Because the common law is a work in progress through and through, there is no manual or guidebook to follow in determining when to change or whether such change will be progressive. However, contrary to the reservations of many judges and jurists, the common law has shown that its capacity to adapt to changing circumstances is a vital feature of its historical struggle for both survival and success. Indeed, the common law seems to have been energized by recognizing the force of the old adage that when you are finished changing, you are finished. It is a compliment to the political wit and institutional savvy of common law judges that, whatever they or their theoretical apologists might say, they have largely taken a pragmatic approach to their adjudicative responsibilities. They tend not to let abstract considerations get in the way of practical solutions. This is not to suggest that the solutions they choose or the changes they make are always the best or even the better ones. This is a matter for social evaluation and political contestation accordingly. While they might mouth certain traditional platitudes about the need for predictability and stability in the common law, the judges tend to act on a quite different basis. As the iconoclastic William Douglas put it, the search for static security, in the law and elsewhere, is misguided, because, the fact is security can only be achieved through constant change. through the wise discarding of old ideas that have outlived their usefulness, and through the adapting of others to current facts. Indeed, the success of the common law has been this ability to be flexible, open, experimental, and adaptable. The knack is to intervene in such a way so as not to establish rigidities and ossification, but to maintain the capacity for change and alteration in the immediate interventions made. To the extent that it can do this, the common law will have gone some way toward redeeming its performance and potential as a work in progress. Conclusion. Thus, it can be reported that the Kuhnian lessons of Darwinian evolution are that everything is always on the march, that changing one thing will likely affect everything else, and that progress is a temporary and contextual achievement. In terms of law, therefore, it is important to grasp that, whatever else it might or might not offer, and it might well have no application to law, an evolutionary perspective is not about generating a universal agenda for change or providing a justification for law's particular development. Instead, it is about developing an attitude or approach to law that recommends, among other things, cultivating a healthy skepticism about formulaic recipes for legal success, about simplistic notions of legal progress, about the predictive power of rational planning, about the widespread tendency toward reductionist explanations, and about the sense that jurists are or can never be entirely on top of things. Lawyers and judges need to nurture situation sense and practical savvy as much as philosophical sophistication and abstract theorizing. If there is still to be talk about evolution, then it must be in a thoroughly descriptive and morally neutral manner. Moreover, insofar as evolution talks in terms of natural selection as being about solving problems, it must not be forgotten that it has nothing to tell us about the problems that will require solutions. This is a crucial insight for common lawyers as well as evolutionists of all persuasions. In a jurisprudential manner of speaking, common law judges offer up what they believe to be the best answer to a pressing problem out of a varying series of possible good answers. However, there is no one right answer or perfect solution. The complexity and contingency of the social environment make that possibility fantastical and far-fetched. In a Gadamerian way of speaking, there is no one context of contexts and, therefore, no set or self-evident problem to be answered, let alone one right answer to be sought or given. The task of interpretation permeates the whole problem-answering process. Whether particular innovations work over time will be as much a matter of serendipitous accident as deliberate design, because the environment will change, and the only question is how it will change. Law will also have to change in order to adapt to those changes. However, in fulfilling their roles and responsibilities as participants in a work in progress, judges and jurists of the common law will be well advised to look beyond the habits and ideals of the soapy Sams and Bulldogs of the contemporary jurisprudential world. Instead of trying to pin down the essence of the common law or grope toward formulaic solutions, it is surely better to admire the complexity and dynamism of the common law and to appreciate its essential unessentialness. By holding on to the desire for constancy and coherence, the search for a better understanding of life and the common law will be seriously compromised. In this regard, Wittgenstein's typically gnomic criticism of many traditional theoreticians for maintaining that the solution to the problem of life is seen in the vanishing of this problem is to the pragmatic point. There are no permanent solutions to life's problems because life is problematic, and any effort to resist that conclusion is itself a problem. Progress in law will only be made when judges and jurists stop thinking in terms of eternal problems and universal solutions. Instead, true to the common law's most useful image of itself, they must embrace the fact that the common law is a tradition of transformation in which both existing law and its possible changes are works in progress,